This is India, the world's fourth largest economy, growing at rates that outpace most major nations, home to some of the fastest rising cities and most powerful companies on the planet. From the financial towers of Mumbai to the tech corridors of Bangalore, India is increasingly being seen as the next engine of global growth. But India has a problem, and it is not a small one. Because beneath that growth lies a reality that is far harder to ignore. Nearly 800 million people still depend on government food support just to survive. Every year, more than 10 million people enter the workforce with no guarantee of finding meaningful employment. Millions more are technically employed, but trapped in work that produces little value and offers no real path forward. This is not just inequality, this is a system under pressure. And the roots of that pressure trace back to a decision made more than half a century ago. A decision that shaped how India built its economy, how it created jobs, and ultimately, how it left hundreds of millions behind. Because when a country of this scale gets one stage of development wrong, it doesn't just slow progress, it changes the fate of an entire generation. Under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, India chose a path that was heavily influenced by central planning and state control. The logic at the time was not entirely irrational, private capital was limited, industrial capacity was weak, and there was deep suspicion of allowing wealth and power to concentrate in private hands. So, the state stepped in, not just as a regulator, but as the primary entrepreneur. Heavy industries, steel plants, energy, infrastructure, these were all to be built and controlled by the government. On paper, this approach promised stability, coordination, and long-term planning. In reality, it created an economic structure where efficiency was secondary to control and innovation was often suffocated under bureaucracy. Instead of a dynamic industrial base driven by competition and scale, India developed a system where growth was slow, fragmented, and heavily regulated. What followed came to be known as the License Raj, a dense web of permits and approvals that made starting, expanding, or even operating a business a prolonged negotiation with the state. While other countries in Asia were aggressively building export-oriented manufacturing sectors, India remained hesitant, cautious, and inward-looking. The consequence of that hesitation was not immediately visible, but it would become critical over time. Because industrialization is not just about producing goods, it is about absorbing labor at scale. It is about taking millions of people from low-productivity agriculture and moving them into higher productivity factory work. It is the single most reliable pathway that countries have used to build a middle class. India, however, took a different turn. When economic liberalization finally came in 1991, under P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, the country did not double down on manufacturing with the same urgency. Instead, it leaped ahead into services. Companies like Infosys, Tata Consultancy Services, and Wipro turned India into a global IT powerhouse. Cities like Bangalore became synonymous with outsourcing and software development, and it looked like India had found a shortcut to development. But that shortcut came with a hidden flaw. Services do not absorb labor at scale, especially not low-skilled labor. They reward education, specialization, and language skills. They create high-value output, but for a relatively small segment of the population. And so, while India was celebrating its emergence as a global IT hub, a massive segment of its workforce was being left behind. This is where the backlog begins. Millions of people who would, in another model, have moved into factories found no such pathway available. Instead, they remained in agriculture, where nearly half the workforce contributes to less than a fifth of the economy. Or they moved into informal jobs that offered little stability and almost no upward mobility. This is what economists refer to as disguised unemployment, where multiple individuals share work that could be done by far fewer people, not because it is efficient, but because there are no alternatives. The scale of this mismatch becomes almost absurd when you look at specific examples. When the Indian Railways announced around 90,000 job openings, it received approximately 28 million applications. This is not competition, that is desperation. It is a signal that the economy is not creating enough avenues for people to earn a stable living, even at the lowest rungs. And instead of resolving that imbalance, several policy choices have continued to reinforce it. India's labor laws, many of which date back decades, have made it extremely difficult for firms to scale. Once a company crosses certain thresholds, such as employing more than 300 workers, it faces strict regulations around layoffs and closures. In practical terms, this means that hiring becomes a long-term liability. Entrepreneurs are forced to think twice before expanding, knowing that they cannot easily adjust their workforce in response to market conditions. So, they don't scale. They stay small, informal, and under the radar. And that creates a missing middle in the economy. Now, layer on top of that the global shift that was supposed to be India's moment. As companies began diversifying away from China in what is often called the China Plus One strategy, India was widely expected to be the primary beneficiary. But supply chains did not flow as anticipated. Instead of moving to India at scale, manufacturing shifted to Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Mexico. Countries that offered more efficient logistics, simpler regulatory frameworks, and faster integration into global trade networks. Companies do not avoid countries randomly. They follow infrastructure logic. In Vietnam, ports are efficient, power supply is reliable, and trade agreements reduce friction. In India, power is not reliable and it is very costly. Logistics costs account for roughly 14% of GDP compared to around 8 to 10% in more competitive economies. That is not a labor problem, that is a system problem. And it shows up clearly in industries where India should have dominated. Take textiles. Despite being one of the largest producers of cotton, India holds only about 3% of global garment exports, far behind Bangladesh and Vietnam. The reasons are not mysterious. Technology adoption has been slow, only a fraction of production lines are automated compared to competitors. Productivity per worker lags behind, many firms continue to operate with outdated machinery. Not because they prefer inefficiency, but because upgrading requires capital, scale, and a regulatory environment that supports expansion. Automation levels in Indian textile factories hover around 25 to 30% compared to nearly 60% in China. Productivity per worker is significantly lower, with Indian workers producing 20 to 30% fewer garments per shift than their counterparts in competing countries. Companies like Kytex Garments Limited reflect this tension. Despite strong market valuations, growth in output has remained relatively modest, highlighting the gap between financial performance and real industrial expansion. And here lies the dilemma. If India does not modernize its industries, it falls behind globally. But if it automates aggressively, it reduces the need for labor in a country where industrial labor is the primary driver of employment. This is what happens when industrialization is delayed. The window does not stay open forever, and meanwhile, the pressure continues to build. Every year, another 10 to 13 million people enter the workforce. Cities become more crowded, competition intensifies, informal employment expands. And the gap between those who benefit from growth and those who are excluded from it continues to widen. This is why nearly 800 million people still depend on food welfare. It is not just a social policy, it is a signal. A signal that despite decades of growth, a significant portion of the population has not been integrated into a productive economic system. India is not unaware of this gap, and in recent years, the government has made a series of aggressive attempts to reignite manufacturing and pull the country back into the industrial race. Initiatives like the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, designed to reward companies for scaling domestic manufacturing, the Make in India campaign aimed at turning the country into a global production hub, and the creation of large integrated textile zones under the PM Mitra Parks are all built around the same idea, that India needs factories, and it needs them at scale. But there are also, in many ways, attempts to solve a problem that has been building for decades. Because industrial ecosystems are not created overnight, they require deep supply chains, efficient logistics, flexible labor markets, and a regulatory environment that allows firms to grow without fear of being trapped by their own expansion. And without addressing those underlying constraints, policy initiatives, no matter how ambitious, risk running into the same structural limits that have held back industrial growth in the past. But what do you think? Do you think India will find its way around this industrialization gap? Let us know in the comments and subscribe.